Welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Institute Online Lincoln Symposium. My name is Michelle A. Crowell, and I will serve as your host of this series through May 3rd. This live stream speaker symposium is focused on the life, times, and legacy of President Abraham Lincoln. You can learn more about the Lincoln Symposium event schedule by visiting the Ford's Theater website at www.fords.org or the Abraham Lincoln Institute website at www.lincoln-institute.org. A note to all our viewers, we are taking your questions on our social media platforms. Later in the program, we will have a Q&A section with today's speakers, moderated by my colleague, Jonathan W. White. Please feel free to submit your questions so that we may share them with the speakers then. Finally, the Abraham Lincoln Institute would like to take this opportunity to thank Paul Tatro, Erica Scott, Gary Erskine, Carolina Dulce, Lauren B.A., Juliana Avery, Andrea Bowman, and the staff of Ford's Theater for all their hard work to make this virtual symposium possible. Our first speaker is David S. Reynolds, Distinguished Professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is the author or editor of 16 books, including his current biography, Abe, Abraham Lincoln in His Times. This book has received numerous accolades, including this year's Abraham Lincoln Institute Book Award and the Lincoln Prize of the Gilder Lehrman Society. It is also among the Wall Street Journal's top 10 books of the year. His previous award-winning books include Walt Whitman's America and John Brown, Abolitionist. Professor Reynolds is a regular reviewer for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times Book Review, and the New York Review of Books. Speaking today on Lincoln and popular culture, we welcome David Reynolds to the program.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Michelle. And it's great to be here at the 2021 ALI Symposium to speak on Lincoln and popular culture. Let me thank the Institute for recognizing my book, Abe, with this year's book award. It means a lot to me to be recognized by this very special group of Lincoln aficionados and scholars. My book, Abe, tells the story of the cross-fertilization between Lincoln and his surrounding culture. Lincoln was unusually responsive to the spirit of the hour, and this responsiveness fostered his practicality and compassion. My book describes the reform movements, the poems, the music, the plays, the popular humor, and so forth that influenced him and that he borrowed from in his historic effort to point the nation towards civil rights. Today, I'm going to talk just a little snippet from the book about two figures of popular culture that are significant for understanding Lincoln. His favorite humorist, Petroleum Nasby, and an actor he admired, though the feeling was hardly mutual, that is John Wilkes Booth. There are surprising links between Nasby and Booth that illuminate Lincoln's racial attitudes and help explain the circumstances of the assassination at Ford's Theater. Of all the popular humorists Lincoln loved to read, by far the most important to him was Petroleum Vesuvius Nasby, the pen name for the Ohio author David Ross Locke. During the Civil War, Locke wrote many humor pieces in the form of comical letters or papers that were widely reprinted in newspapers and then collected in books or pamphlets. In these sketches, Locke used the speaker, the persona of Petroleum Nasby, an ill-spoken drunken lout who impersonated the views of so-called Copperheads, or Northern Democrats who were calling for a peaceful compromise with the South, regardless of what happened to slavery. And of course, Lincoln was very much opposed to Copperheads. Locke's satirical sketches of Copperheads were so budding and so popular that commentators credited Locke with contributing to the fall of slavery. The Massachusetts politician George Boutwell declared that, quote, the crushing of the rebellion could be credited to three forces: the Army, the Navy, and the NASB letters. Senator Charles Sumner remarked, unquestionably, the NASB papers were among the influences and agencies by which disloyalty in all its forms was exposed and public opinion was assured upon the right side. And he went on, it's impossible to measure their value against the devices of slavery and its supporters. Each letter was like a speech or one of those songs that stir the people. That was Sumner, and the New York Herald said of NASB, he was the most quoted man of letters in the country, and his oddities were repeated by statesmen, soldiers, the clergy, everybody. And among those who repeated them was Abraham Lincoln, who read the NASB letters as they appeared in periodicals and books from 1861 onward. President Lincoln enjoyed Locke's writings so much that he often shared them with others. He committed to memory several of the NASB sketches, which he recited spontaneously at key moments. When he didn't have one stored in his brain, he pulled out a NASB book from either his pocket or his drawer and read from it. One evening, on a typical evening, a group of politicians appeared in the president's office with a pile of official papers for him to consider. He looked at the documents wearily and he pushed them aside. He pulled down from his drawer a NASB pamphlet and read one of the sketches aloud. He periodically broke out into an explosive laugh, which a witness compared to the neigh of a wild horse on his native prairie. Lincoln enjoyed reading the pamphlet so much that he joked at the end of the reading, I'm going to write to Petroleum NASB to come down here, and I intend to tell him if he will communicate his talent to me, I will swap places with him. So, he really had an admiration for NASB. What was it about David Ross Locke that made him unique in Lincoln's eyes? In a word, Locke performed crucial cultural work for Lincoln and the Republican Party. He fought political battles with an intensity and viciousness that Lincoln, as a unifying president, avoided. Locke's mission was to expose the racism and the fundamental amorality of the Copperheads. He caricatured democratic attitudes with such satirical force that he served as a one-person battering ram against racial prejudice in that era. By grossly exaggerating Copperhead views, Locke made them absurdly monstrous. Lincoln said elsewhere that American humor was characterized by grotesqueness, his word, and Locke gave that in spades, along with a sharp political message that sliced through Democrats. The Democrats were the conservatives back then. Republicans were the liberals on slavery, particularly the Copperhead Democrats. As the Detroit Tribune remarked, during the war, NASB's pen was mightier than the sword. To the enemy, it was a rapier, keen and dreaded. Petroleum Vesuvius NASB was as inflammable as his first name, as explosive as his middle name, and as nasty as his surname sounds. To us, it's shocking that Lincoln's favorite humor character used the N-word liberally, but coming from Petroleum NASB, that word was scathingly ironic, an ugly reflection of the racism Locke saw among conservatives of the day. The NASB character exposed the stupidity of Lincoln's pro-slavery enemies. In ridiculously inept prose, full of misspellings and non sequiturs, NASB, the quintessential Copperhead, calls for permanent white rule. His motto is America for white men, enraged by the increasing number of free blacks in the North. NASB yells, fellow whites, arouse, the enemy is onto us, our hearth is in danger. He announces that when Black people, he used a different word, ruled and controlled society, then you will remember this warning, predicting that a government controlled by anti-slavery Republicans would give rise to interracial marriage. NASB asserts, this alarming amalgamation of the races must be prohibited. He was way beyond the Proud Boys, I'm afraid, this NASB character. Of course, Locke meant totally the opposite. He was caricaturing these people. NASB's worst fear is that the Lincoln administration will lead inevitably to Black citizenship. NASB demands, do you want Black people to march up to the polls with you to vote? Do you want their children mixed with yours in schools? Do you want them on juries and holding office in your township? My God, think of it. In his frantic effort to prevent such horrors, NASB calls for the revoking of the Emancipation Proclamation and the reinstatement of slavery. Locke castigates famous Copperheads by making them NASB's heroes. NASB sings praise to Copperheads like Clement Vallandigham, Fernando Woods, Samuel Cox, and Franklin Pierce. At one point, NASB has a dream of his idea of a future utopia in which Black people have been exterminated. Jefferson Davis is the emperor, and Copperheads are royalty. NASB is excited to find himself in this dream. The Duke de Nasby. Utterly opposed to the Civil War, NASB, in one sketch, and sees President Lincoln, NASB introduces himself to Lincoln as a freeborn Democrat and tells Lincoln, you are a gorilla, a fiendish ape, a thirster after blood. He tells Lincoln he will back the war only if the president follows his command to revoke the Emancipation Proclamation, disarm African-American soldiers, and send Black fugitives back to their Southern enslavers. Incensed by Lincoln's unresponsiveness to these requests, NASB leaves in a huff, saying, Lincoln, gorilla, ape, I have done with you. Petroleum NASB announces his misery when Lincoln wins the 1864 election and becomes apoplectic when in April 1865, Lee surrenders to Grant. In reporting Lincoln's assassination, Locke has NASB voice regret that the president and his cabinet had not been killed in 1862 before the damage to Southern slavery had been done. Now, everything, of course, that came out of NASB's mouth was exactly the opposite of what David Ross Locke actually felt. Locke and Lincoln admired each other immensely. They met a couple of times in the 1850s when Locke was in Illinois reporting the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They had a long friendly meeting in Quincy, Illinois in October 1858 after the sixth debate with Douglas. The two joked and talked politics. Later, Locke twice visited the president who had written him from the White House. Why don't you come to Washington and see me? Is there no place you want? Come on and I'll give you any place that you ask for that you're capable of fitting and fit to fill. Although a government appointment did not work out, Locke called his meetings with Lincoln delightful. All told, Locke said Lincoln was, quote, the greatest man in some respects who ever lived, and in all respects, the most lovable, a man whose great work gave him the heart of every human being throughout the civilized world. Lincoln's appreciation of Locke's caustic, biting humor reveals that below his veil of moderation and caution lay a radically progressive self. Within Lincoln, the political centrist on his tightrope lurked a leftist abolitionist who loathed racism and who wanted dramatic social change on behalf of Black people. Because Locke's words as NASB were in exact reverse to his real meaning, we see the future America that Locke and by association Lincoln envisaged, an integrated nation in which people of color were citizens and voters, and interracial marriage was permitted. If we flash forward to the last day of Lincoln's life, April 14th, 1865, we find that Petroleum Nasby played a major role. It was 5 days after Appomattox, and Washington was bursting with celebration. Lincoln had relaxed in the afternoon by taking a carriage ride with Mary, his wife. Neither of them especially wanted to go to the theater that evening, and Lincoln had been warned against it by several who were worried about the potential danger. But Lincoln was always close to the public. He felt obliged to go because the newspapers had announced that he would attend Our American Cousin that evening at Ford's Theater. Did Lincoln lose his life because of Petroleum Nasby? Well, in some sense, yes. First of all, he was delayed in leaving for the theater for almost an hour, in part because of Nasby. In the late afternoon, after returning to the White House from his carriage ride, he read aloud several chapters of Locke's The Nasby Papers to two Illinois friends, Governor Richard Oglesby and General Isham Haney, who had come for a visit. Doubtless, the group laughed often as the president read aloud the words of the whiskey-swigging, racist Petroleum Nasby with his fulminations against Lincoln, ape, gorilla. For the moment, Lincoln was too entertained by Nasby to think of anything else. Oglesby recalled, they kept sending for him to come to dinner. He promised each time to go, but would continue reading the book. Finally, a peremptory order to come at once drew Lincoln away. So he was kind of delayed for quite a long time before going to dinner. Had the timing been different, would Booth not have been able to shoot Lincoln at 10:15 that evening? We cannot know, but we can say that it was tragically ironic that Lincoln was reading Petroleum Nasby only hours before he was shot by a real-life Petroleum Nasby, a pro-Southern Lincoln hater with a low opinion of Black people and a penchant for strong liquor. Though Southern-born in Maryland, John Wilkes Booth spent most of his time during the war in the North, where most of the acting opportunities were. Though the North made Booth a stage star, he was wretched there because of the anti-slavery environment. He called slavery one of the greatest blessings that God ever bestowed on a favored nation. Slavery was just marvelous. Booth regarded Lincoln with sneering condescension. This man's appearance, his pedigree, his low, coarse jokes and anecdotes, his vulgar similes, his frivolity are a disgrace to the seat he holds. Kind of like Nasby saying, you gorilla, you ape, that kind of thing. At a social gathering, Booth performed a Copperhead song, which lamented the decline of liberty and the unnatural rise of Black people that Booth thought Lincoln had brought about. One of the song's verses went, but there's a N kingdom. I don't like to use the N word in public, but there's an N kingdom coming, and the king is Abraham. So it sounded exactly like Petroleum Nasby. These lines, which sounded like Nasby, reflected the typical Copperhead charge that Lincoln was a horrid, so-called Negro-loving despot. Booth's anxiety spiked after Lincoln won re-election in November 1864. Because there were no presidential term limits at the time, they came in 1947, it seemed possible that Lincoln's presidency could continue indefinitely, a nightmare for John Wilkes Booth, who planned the deaths of Lincoln and others around him. Just as Petroleum Nasby envisaged killing Lincoln's cabinet members along with Abe himself, Booth, a real-life Nasby, targeted not just Lincoln, but other leaders as well. The plan, as finalized on April 14th, was that he would kill Lincoln and General Grant at Ford's Theater with the president, while two co-orders, Secretary of State William Seward and Vice President Andrew Johnson, elsewhere in the city. And the new pictures. What was it about Booth that drove him to commit the act that others only contemplated? After all, assassination plots were common. There were plenty of Nasbys around who wanted to kill Lincoln. Booth alone, among would-be assassins, had long been immersed in an identifiably American style of intense acting, what today might be called exaggerated method acting. The complete identification with the role one plays was a technique he learned from his intense actor father, Junius Brutus Booth, on the right there, who once became so overwrought as Othello that he nearly suffocated the Desdemona of the evening with a pillow. He had to be pulled away. And another time, in a sword fight scene, he drove his opponent out of the theater and continued the sword fight on the street. It's what I call the American style of acting. Of the three Booth children who became prominent actors, Edwin, who's in the middle here, John Wilkes, who's on the left, and Junius Jr., who's on the right, only John adopted their father's tempestuous American style of acting. A Boston reviewer said that John had, quote, more of the native fire and fury of his great father than any in his family. John Wilkes Booth relished violent stage roles. He made Shakespeare's Richard someone, quote, who loved murder for murder's sake alone, as a reviewer said. John wielded his sword so vigorously that once his foe fell off the stage and into the orchestra pit, a month before he assassinated Lincoln while playing an evil duke in a tragedy, Booth was so realistic that he tortured a woman on the wheel so much that a spectator was truly frightened by, quote, the hideous, malevolent expression of his distorted countenance, the fierce glare and ugly roll of his eyes as he gleefully boasted about his masterpiece of cruelty. For John Wilkes Booth, the extreme American acting style led to a merging of stage characters with real life. He often played rebels who rose up against tyrants, and Booth didn't just identify with these stage assassins, he became one of them. In his mind, he really was one of them. America itself was now his stage. Lincoln was his targeted tyrant. Assassinating the despot Lincoln in a theater would be Booth's ultimate sensational role. A couple of hours before he shot Lincoln, he recommended to a hotel clerk that he should go to Ford's Theater that evening because, as Booth said, there's going to be some splendid acting there tonight. So he really felt he was part of a play, and he was the American actor to the hilt. The Lincoln assassination was the American acting style to the hilt, and Booth himself was David Ross Locke's Petroleum Nasby come to horrible, horrible life. Thank you.
Our second distinguished speaker today is H.W. Brands, who holds the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in History at the University of Texas at Austin. An Oregon native, Professor Brands sold cutlery across the American West before earning graduate degrees in mathematics and history and teaching at Vanderbilt University and Texas A&M University. He writes on American history and politics, with books including The Zealot and the Emancipator, Dreams of El Dorado, and Heirs of the Founders. Several of his books have been bestsellers, and two, Traitor to His Class, The Privileged Life and Radical Presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and The First American, The Life and Times of Benjamin Franklin, were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. And now to speak on The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, we welcome H.W. Brands to the program.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks to the Abraham Lincoln Institute for the opportunity to address the audience today. I wrote a book about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln because I wanted to get at a question that is one that every citizen in a democracy has to deal with at some time or another. And the question is basically this: what does the good person do? What does a good citizen do when his or her country is involved in something that person considers to be wrong? What does the good person do in the face of evil? That's a sort of a more philosophical, existential way of putting it. And I wanted to look at this in the context of slavery. And I wanted to look at it viewed from the perspective of John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. And the crux of the question is, what do you do as I say, in the face of evil. And it presupposes that you've concluded that something is evil. And I say that this is a question that occurs to every citizen of democracy. I would go beyond that and say it probably occurs to everybody at some time or other in their lives. What do we do when we see something around us that is wrong? How do we respond? And for people in a democracy, the first thing we can do is vote. We can show up at the polls and we can choose somebody, if we're given a choice between the thing, continuing this thing that's wrong and trying to do away with the thing that's wrong, and we can cast a vote. But perhaps we can do more. We've seen in the last year that a lot of people who are upset with racial attitudes, with policing, with inequality have taken to the streets. Protest is certainly an American tradition. It goes back before the American Revolution, which grew out of protest, and it continues until today. The big question confronting John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, or at least the one that they confronted in common during the two lives that overlapped pretty closely, was slavery. And they came to conclude, both of them, that slavery was a great evil. But that's only the first part of the question. The heart of the question is, so what do you do about it? It's one thing to say slavery is wrong, but then what do you do about it? Now, this is the question that I explore and develop in the book, but I'll say also that because John Brown was born in 1800, Abraham Lincoln in 1809, because they lived till 1859 in the case of John Brown, 1865 in the case of Abraham Lincoln, their lives covered a period in which attitudes generally towards slavery change. And that's very much part of the story. So I try to tell the story through the lives of the individuals. I don't try to cover all of American history during this time, but I do look at attitudes towards slavery. And I'll say that at the time John Brown was born in 1800, the idea that slavery was wrong, that slavery was fundamentally evil, was by no means a majority view in the United States. There were a lot of people who thought that it was wrong, but that it was an overriding wrong, that it was the most evil thing confronting American society. That was in 1800, that remained a distinctly minority viewpoint. There were some groups, Quakers, some Methodists, who thought this. But in terms of rising to a political question, yes, there were people especially in the North, who concluded that it was wrong enough that it needed to be done away with in their own states. But for most of those northern states, it was a relatively inexpensive decision to make. I should point out, most of the listeners this afternoon will be aware that slavery was perfectly legal in every state in the United States in 1776. By 1800, the northern states were well on their way to eliminating, but as I say, it really wasn't a big deal in most of the northern states because there weren't very many slaves and there weren't very large economic interests at stake. It's worth noting as well that attitudes in the North, in let's say the 1780s, at the time of the writing and adoption of the Constitution, attitudes in the North regarding slavery didn't differ that much from attitudes in the South. In both parts of the country, there was a belief that slavery was sort of a necessary evil. Almost nobody in the South, even in the South, even among slaveholders themselves, looked upon slavery as a good thing. There was John Calhoun's assertion that slavery was a positive good was still a long way in the future. That wouldn't come until the 1830s. And most people, if you look at Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, most the Virginia slaveholders, other Southern slaveholders, they believed that slavery was a part of life. It was an institution they had inherited. They weren't crazy about it. If other things had been equal, they would have just been happy enough without it, but there it was. So it was one of those things in life that was required as they sought to make the Southern economy operate the way they thought the Southern economy ought to operate. Northerners in the 1780s had no grave compunctions. They looked upon it as a necessary evil as well, but in their case, as I suggested earlier, it wasn't so necessary, and so it was easier to focus on the evil. And the result was that by the time Abraham Lincoln is born in 1809, slavery has become essentially a Southern institution. And it's probably, again, worth a reminder that Northerners would often take a position that made them sound to the South as though they considered themselves morally superior to Southerners. And that for obvious reasons, that would get pretty annoying to Southerners who could point out that you had slaves until fairly recently yourself, and so get off your high moral horse. But it was a position that would be increasingly possible to take the farther the North got from slavery itself. Okay, and by the time, to fast forward here, by 1860, opinions had changed a great deal more. By no means, however, was everybody in the North opposed to slavery on moral grounds. A lot of them were opposed to slavery on political grounds because it seemed to serve the interests of the South, and the South was becoming obnoxious in national politics. But there's still a range of opinion on, so how wrong is slavery? And that's going to condition the answer to the question, so what are you going to do about it? So looking at John Brown first. John Brown was born in New England. He grew up in Ohio. And his family was opposed to slavery, but he didn't quite know exactly what to make of it. He recalled in later years that there was a moment, a kind of epiphany that occurred to him. He was a boy and he was playing in Ohio, and he was in a part of Ohio where one encountered slaves, even though Ohio was a free state and always had been. But slaves would come and go with their masters, and they were working in jobs. And so John Brown could see free workers working in a field and enslaved workers working in a field. And he, as a kid, he hardly thought much about the difference between it. Didn't reflect on were their lives that much different until one day he was playing with this black boy, and the two were playing and sort of getting along. And then all of a sudden, this white man comes up to the black boy and starts yelling at the black boy, and then starts beating the black boy around the head. And John Brown is scratching his own head, saying, well, what's going on here? And he realizes, it is, at least as he recollects later, he realized for the first time that this is the difference between my position and this black kid's position. That somebody can do this to him, and nobody could do this to me except possibly my own father, but that's a different kind of thing. And so John Brown began thinking, at least as he recalls, that, okay, there is something really wrong about slavery here. He gravitated in the direction of many people in Ohio, in the direction of stronger opposition to slavery. Not yet an abolitionist exactly. He's opposed to slavery. He'd like to see slavery go away, but he's not ready to sort of take up even rhetorical arms against it. Part of it is that he didn't know exactly what he was doing with himself in life. And one of the reasons that John Brown wound up as a militant abolitionist was he never really caught on doing anything else. It is often the case that people find their calling through process of elimination. And John Brown really didn't have much of success as a farmer or as a herder of cattle or sheep or in the various business enterprises he got in. And so he was always looking for something to do, something that he could consider really important. He had a second, maybe a larger epiphany in 1837. He was living in Hudson, Ohio, which is a hotbed of abolition by this time. And I should point out that when we're into the 1830s, the abolitionist movement is really taking form as this political, cultural, even sort of moral/religious movement. And abolitionism has a real following, and John Brown is hearing a lot more about this. And he learns that an abolitionist editor, Elijah Lovejoy, has just been murdered in Illinois. And John Brown concluded, as many people did, as many people who were opposed to slavery, and many people actually who were in favor of slavery, thought that, wait a minute, this is getting out of hand, because here is a man who has been murdered simply for expressing opinions against slavery. There were all sorts of charges until then that the slave power was gaining a stranglehold on American life. When the slave power could reach out and murder somebody on free soil, this seemed to corroborate those charges that slavery was simply getting out of hand. And if allowed to persist, it would snuff out the liberties of everybody, it would snuff out the lives of people who were opposed to it. So at this point, John Brown stands up in his church in Hudson, Ohio, and says, before the eyes of God, before the eyes of the congregation, I hereby dedicate the rest of my life to undying opposition to slavery. John Brown has become an abolitionist. But the question remains, what are you going to do about it? John Brown has one thing to say. You're opposed to slavery, but what are you going to do about it? It takes him another 20 years, really, to figure out what that means. He moves his family to upstate New York, and they take part in this communal experiment where free black people are living next to free white people, and the idea is to demonstrate that the black people can be as productive and successful as the white people, and John Brown is all for this. He talks about starting a school for black children to demonstrate sort of the same thing. But he's still looking for his way to make a contribution. And then comes the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which opened Kansas territory, previously off limits to slavery by virtue of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, tears up that part of the Missouri Compromise and opens Kansas territory potentially to slavery. This really kindled a spark in John Brown. It energized the abolitionist movement because this seemed to be further evidence that slavery was expanding. There was a hope among many moderate anti-slavery folks that if slavery could simply be contained, then eventually it would die of its own weight, as it had died of its own weight in the North. But with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it looked like slavery was breaking out of the region in which it had previously been contained. And so John Brown was talked by his son, several of his adult sons, into going to Kansas and taking up arms in the struggle against slavery. Arms, well, Kansas was open to settlement by free settlers and by pro-slavery settlers, and each could bring their property. So the folks from the free states could bring their horses and their mules, and the folks from the slave states could bring their horses and their mules and their slaves. And the idea was that under Stephen Douglas's formula of popular sovereignty, when the time came that Kansas had enough people to qualify for statehood, they would get together, they would vote on a constitution. The constitution would say that Kansas would be a free state or a slave state. So the rush was on to see who could fill up Kansas with either pro-slavery settlers or anti-slavery settlers. And John Brown takes part in this. And when he gets there, he finds that, well, to put it bluntly, that violent abolitionism appeals to him. It seems to fulfill this itch that John Brown was trying to scratch for a while, because he discovers that he has a knack for, well, I won't call it exactly military leadership, but we'll say paramilitary leadership. People will follow him. He has a kind of magnetism, and people will follow him into battle. People will follow him to do some of the most heinous things. John Brown, following a raid on the Free State community of Lawrence, in which much of the city was destroyed, John Brown decides to send a message to the pro-slavery side. And he leads a small band of his followers, and they descend on the hamlet, on a small hamlet, a pro-slavery hamlet on the banks of Pottawatomie Creek. And there in the middle of the night, John Brown and his men drag 5 pro-slavery settlers from their beds and hack them to death with broadswords, brutally murder them. Clearly an act of what these days we would call terrorism, and some people in those days did too. It was a violent message making a political point. If you pro-slavery people come to Kansas, this could happen to you. So John Brown all of a sudden becomes notorious. And he's notorious. He's wanted for murder in Kansas territory. He's wanted for murder by federal authorities throughout the country. But in those days, it was fairly easy to get around in disguise. There really wasn't photography outside of the big cities, and John Brown didn't sit and have his photograph taken. And so people who were looking for John Brown didn't know exactly what he looked like. He changed his name. He traveled and under various aliases and disguises. He continued to raise money in support of his anti-slavery activities. The fact that he was known to be responsible for these murders in Kansas increased his visibility among the abolitionist movement, increased his notoriety, and people were willing to give money to John Brown. Without telling his supporters, John Brown actually had changed his strategy. He was going to go not back to Kansas, but he was going to take the battle against slavery to the slave South itself. And this gave rise to the raid on Harper's Ferry. I'm not going to go into detail here. This is familiar enough. But my point is that John Brown, at a relative, well, no, I'd say sort of in the middle of his life, he died at the age of 59, so halfway through his life, he concluded that slavery was the greatest evil facing the country, facing the United States. And the question was, what are you going to do about it? John Brown said, I'm going to take up arms against it. I'm going to wage war against slavery. Slavery is so evil that this is the required response of the good man. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809, so he's a little bit younger than John Brown. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. The family moved to Indiana, and then he eventually moved to Illinois. He inherited a dislike for slavery. And the dislike for slavery was shared by many working class whites who expected to make a living by the sweat of their brow, in part because it was simply harder to make a decent living when you had to compete with enslaved labor. They could always undercut your wage scale. There was that. And there was just a general feeling that slavery made a community a bad place to live. And so Abraham Lincoln's father took him to Indiana, and then Abraham Lincoln moved to Illinois, as I say. Abraham Lincoln himself had this learned this kind of moderate antipathy to slavery. In his case, the epiphany came, as he explained, on a trip to New Orleans. He was hired to float a flatboat of cargo down the Mississippi, down the Ohio, down the Mississippi to New Orleans, where for the first time he saw a slave auction. Again, Lincoln was familiar with slaves working on the docks. He had seen slaves working in the fields. He had seen enslaved workers doing this, that, and the other, and doing the kind of stuff that white workers did too. And so, all right, they don't have as many freedoms, but it really came home. The evil of slavery came home to Abraham Lincoln, by his own recollection, when he saw a slave auction. Because there, for the first time, he understood what the institution of chattel slavery was about. These people are property. They're like horses. They're like pigs. They're like cows. They just, they're examined this way. The auctioneer bangs down the hammer and off they go. For people to be sold like property really offended Lincoln's sense of morality, his sense of fairness. He developed this opposition to slavery. But his opposition to slavery was tempered by his political ambitions. I think it was also tempered by the fact that he was less sure of himself religiously, for example, than John Brown was. John Brown was convinced that the Almighty was opposed to slavery, and what the Almighty opposed, then John Brown would oppose. Abraham Lincoln had no such firm views regarding religion, and at least regarding what God was telling him to do. And as I say, he was a lawyer. He was a lawyer in Springfield, Illinois, and he tried cases. He took up cases that sometimes involved the ownership of people, that is slaves. He became a politician. And in Illinois was a free state, but to be a militant anti-slavery politician would mean that you're not going to get very far when he first starts into politics. When he finally comes back into politics in the 1850s, he has ambitions. He wants to be a senator from Illinois. He wants to be, eventually he wants to be president of the United States. And Lincoln concluded that although John Brown was right about slavery being wrong, his strategy of dealing with slavery, his way of dealing with the evil of slavery was counterproductive, was wrong in itself. Because in the first place, the raid on Harper's Ferry, in which John Brown tried to instigate a war, an armed uprising of slaves against their masters. Abraham Lincoln concluded this was wrong both as a short-term measure and as a long-term measure. It was wrong, it was counterproductive in the short term because it tightened the shackles on slaves rather than to loosen them. The slaveholders in the South, they looked at the fact that here's this guy from the North who's trying to foment an uprising, and they reduce, if not eliminate entirely, such freedoms as the slaves were allowed. And so life gets more difficult for enslaved men and women in the South in the wake of John Brown's raid. In the long term, Lincoln was very frustrated at what John Brown's raid would do, because Lincoln, as much as he thought that slavery was wrong, if he had to choose between ending slavery and preserving the Constitution every time he would choose the Constitution. Lincoln put the Constitution above opposition to slavery because Lincoln believed that the Constitution was the guarantor of freedoms of all Americans. Lose the Constitution, lose the Union, and nobody's going to be free in the country. Lincoln believed with Henry Clay, his political, well, not exactly mentor, but his political model, what he called his beau ideal of the statesman. Henry Clay had believed that the South eventually, white slaveholders in the South eventually would come to the same conclusion as whites in the North, that slavery no longer suited the evolving economy of the South. And on their own, they would come to the conclusion that slavery needed to be done away with. They'd do it state by state. Lincoln believed, Lincoln hoped that this would happen as well. And so anything that caused Southerners to take alarm in the short term would push back the date when Southerners would conclude on their own that slavery was wrong for them. Lincoln wants to be president of the United States, and he knows that if he scares off people, if they think that he is a John Brown, if they think that John Brown is a Republican, Lincoln goes out of his way to say, John Brown is not a Republican. I'm not like Abraham. I'm not like John Brown. I'm not an abolitionist. I believe that the Constitution guarantees slavery in the states where it continues to exist. This was the position that Lincoln took. Lincoln, eventually, of course, was elected president of the United States. To summarize, John Brown believed that slavery would end as a result of this war that he was going to start at Harper's Ferry. John Brown tried to start a war and failed. John Brown tried to free slaves as a result of this war and failed. The raid on Harper's Ferry didn't free any slaves at all. Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, he adopted a political path instead of the path of violence. He tried to avoid the war, and he believed that emancipation would come by legal means, by constitutional means. Abraham Lincoln failed to prevent the war. I'm not going to say the same war that John Brown started, but he failed to prevent a war. And he was forced to accept emancipation as a way of preserving the Union. So there's an irony here, and the irony is that John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, in answer to this question, what do you do about this evil of slavery? John Brown says, we'll take the violent route to get to emancipation. Abraham Lincoln says, we're going to take the peaceful route to get to emancipation. But they both wind up sort of in the same place. Abraham Lincoln leads the country through the worst war in American history. 600,000, 700,000 people died. But the end is the result that John Brown wanted, and John Brown prophesied on his way to the gallows in 1859. I'll stop there, and I hope we can pursue this by means of discussion and questions.
Thank you both to you both so much. Those were wonderful talks. We've got some questions coming in, and I want to remind our viewers at home that you can post questions on Facebook or Twitter and YouTube, and we'll get to read them on the air. I'll start, Bill, with you. Can you talk a little bit? You close your book by talking about Frederick Douglass and his views of Lincoln. Can you talk about Douglass's experiences with these two men and how Douglass viewed them?
Yeah, first I'll say that as an author of a book about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, if Frederick Douglass hadn't existed, I would have had to invent him or somebody like him. Because I'm telling sort of the parallel lives of John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, who lived at the same time, but they never met each other. Their paths never met directly. They were dealing with the same issue, but from different perspectives and with different short-term goals. Frederick Douglass is the unifying character here. So Frederick Douglass is the one who knew both men. He met John Brown before he met Abraham Lincoln, and he much admired John Brown. He believed that John Brown had a sense of the immediacy of the evil of slavery. Frederick Douglass, being a former slave himself, having escaped to freedom, being one of the most noted abolitionists in the country, naturally gravitated toward the emphasis that John Brown placed on ending slavery, almost by any means. But I say almost by any means, because John Brown invited Frederick Douglass to take part in the raid on Harper's Ferry. And John Brown was thinking, okay, boy, if I could get a high-profile abolitionist like Frederick Douglass to come along, this will lend credibility to this operation that wouldn't have otherwise. And especially a black man, somebody who had been a slave. But Douglass says no. And part of the reason that Douglass says no is that he recognizes that this is probably a suicide mission. Douglass understood, having been a slave himself and having weighed the moment when you're going to go for freedom, recognize that the enslaved folks in the vicinity of Harper's Ferry are not just going to follow anybody who seems to have this crackpot scheme to start a war. they're going to weigh their chances of actually surviving this war. And they're going to say, this isn't going to work. And that's exactly what happened. So part of Frederick Douglass's response was, I'm a writer, I'm not a fighter. But secondly, he knew that this wasn't going to work. Nonetheless, he had to, like every other abolitionist, he had to admire John Brown for having the courage of his convictions, for having the courage to take his views to the point of risking and then finally giving his life for the cause, while Abraham Lincoln always seemed too slow. Now, Douglass was willing to grant Lincoln some leeway for the fact that he was a politician, and politicians have to balance different views. But even after the South seceded and the Civil War began, Douglass thought that Lincoln was just misunderstanding what this war was about. And he really challenged in his own newspaper and on speeches, every chance he got, Lincoln's prioritizing things. Lincoln made very clear that saving the Union came first and any action on slavery came second. In his famous letter to Horace Greeley, he said, my job is to save the Union. I'll save the Union by freeing all the slaves or not by freeing half. My job is to save the Union. And Douglass tried to make the point, the only way you're going to save the Union, Mr. Lincoln, is to free the slaves. And eventually Lincoln came around to that point of view. So it was only at the point that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation that Frederick Douglass could finally say, okay, good going. And then from there to the end of the war, Douglass became a member of Lincoln's sort of loose outer circle. He was somebody that Lincoln would consult with, somebody that Lincoln would try to get to send messages to other folks in the Black community, and somebody that Douglass finally concluded that Lincoln did more for the freedom of Black people than anybody else in American history. But Douglass still thought Lincoln was too slow in doing it.
Yeah. I want to ask a follow-up. You both have written about John Brown. So, David, I want to bring you in on the John Brown question as well. In your book, you write about the meeting that Lincoln and Douglass had in August of 1864, where they thought about using John Brown as a model for getting word to the slaves to become free. Can you talk a little bit about that meeting when Douglass and Lincoln met and what it meant to Douglass?
Yeah, well, as was mentioned, Douglass at first thought that Lincoln was too slow and much more concerned with the Union rather than slavery. But when he actually met Lincoln in August 1864, he found that Lincoln, on a very personal level, had a complete sort of lack of prejudice against African Americans. In fact, he said, there's a statement, he said, he has less prejudice than kind of any white man I've ever met, as much as he admired John Brown. And at that time, Lincoln sort of planned this kind of John Brown-like incursion into the South, in which Frederick Douglass would play a role in leading scouts into the Deep South to try to spread the word of the Emancipation Proclamation to enslaved people who didn't perhaps know about it. And he got together with Martin Delany a little bit later, who was way beyond Black Lives Matter or anything. He was super radical. But anyway, Lincoln as well, with a kind of similar mention. But what was happening is Sherman and Grant were winning the war anyway. So those two missions were kind of obviated. But still, the John Brown and Abraham Lincoln views coming together toward the end of the war certainly did, partly through Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany.
Yeah, I love that meeting with Delany, where Delany comes to meet with Lincoln in, I think, February of 65 and says, we need a Black army to go into the South. And according to Delany's later reminiscences, Lincoln says to him, this is the idea I've been waiting for someone to bring to me. And then, of course, Delany gets commissioned a major a few weeks later. David, let me ask you about Lincoln's love of literature and humor. Can you talk about his just love of those things as a young man, how they developed, and more of its impact on his later life?
He's an example of somebody, and I think it can still apply today, but I mean, he had less than 1 year of school, just here and there, 3 months here, 3 months there, and so forth. So, but he was infinitely curious. He didn't have that many books on the frontier, but as he grew up, he kind of read as much as he could. And he had such a steel trap of a memory that he could read a poem a couple of times. He loved poetry kind of above all. and it would be in his brain, so he knew Shakespeare by the page. Poetry for him really channeled feeling and theme and emotion, and every once in a while during his presidency he would break out with a poem. At the same time, he loved that Lincoln, above all people, ranged the entire breadth of experience from the very highest realm of culture, Shakespeare, the opera and all that, down to the lowest, the kind of dirty jokes and everything kind of in between. Sentimental songs. He loved sentimental songs. So he really had an encompassing kind of vision, and it's really his breadth of vision that kind of fed into his compassion.
Yeah. Bill, what about John Brown's education? Can you tell us about any formal education he had and how his background in that might have put him to where he went? I actually don't recall.
His formal education was quite limited, perhaps not as limited as Abraham Lincoln's. And he clearly was a self-educated person. Again, not to the extent of Lincoln, but on the subject of education, one of the things that I became particularly interested in is how did John Brown ever come up with ideas for engaging in military operations? Because when he led his group, when he led this small abolitionist army in Kansas, he engaged in what were military tactics, didn't rise quite to the level of strategy. When he plotted a Harper's Ferry raid, he was thinking in terms of what we need to do. And so he seems to have read various books on the military. He didn't have the practical experience that was necessary to make these things actually work when confronted with folks who actually knew what they were doing. And so one of the reasons that the Harper's Ferry raid proved such a fiasco was that Brown figured out how to get into Harper's Ferry, which is actually fairly easy if nobody knows you're coming and you do it in the middle of the night. But getting out of Harper's Ferry, once the militia have been alerted, once the townspeople have come up against you, is nearly impossible. And anyone with any military kind of training or even any formal military education would have realized that Harper's Ferry is not the place to start your war against slavery. But that also raises the question regarding Harper's Ferry. So what exactly did Brown think was going to happen as a result of this? And it's clear that by the time he is executed, John Brown has concluded that he is worth more to the abolitionist movement, to the freedom movement, dead than alive. And you can almost see that revelation dawning on him in his days in jail and before the court and all this. But I think, as far as I can tell, when he went into Harper's Ferry, he still hoped that this thing would work. But that's where sort of being a self-taught person can have its downfall.
I think about how Lincoln was checking books out of the Library of Congress to learn about military strategy at the beginning and during the war. Same kind of thing. Can either of you speak to this? At what point did John Brown decide to stay in the engine house at Harper's Ferry and to not go out as he had originally planned? And what caused him to ultimately make that decision? Is that a loaded question? I don't know if it is or not.
No. I think that he was expecting a little more of a explosion among the enslaved people. Some of them did join him, to be sure. Others, in a way, these white people coming, to free the enslaved people, and the ones that didn't know about the raid and so forth, it was like the man from Mars coming. What are you doing here at midnight? Some of them were befuddled, and I think that John Brown kind of kept waiting, and then by the time he waited, the local militia had come up and so forth, and he was really kind of trapped. He even told a train to pass by, and the train spread the word to, and pretty soon Robert E. Lee and the troops came and surrounded him. So, yeah.
Part of the problem was that Brown wasn't quite ruthless enough to do what he was trying to do. And so if he had been willing to shoot townspeople and kill people who sort of had no dog in this fight, then he might have been able to fight his way out. But I think he might have realized when it became clear that there wasn't this this uprising that he had expected. So he had weapons for hundreds or maybe 1,000 people that he had specially made. But there wasn't this flocking to his banner. And he might very well have asked himself, so what am I going to do for my next act? Should I get out of here? And it might have, there's some point to say, I don't know exactly where it is, when he concludes that, okay, I'm not getting out of here. I mean, once he's surrounded, of course, by the U.S. Marines under Robert E. Lee, he knows he's not getting out of there. And he's gonna go down to the end. And he would have been killed, except that the sword that he was struck with by the person who broke in turned out to be just a dress sword rather than the real thing. And so he lives to speak again, not to fight again, but he lives to speak again.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we got a question from a viewer, and the question is, can either speaker comment on what might have been different in Reconstruction period and Jim Crow if Lincoln had not been assassinated? That's a tough one, but I'll throw it out.
My feeling, I mean, it's counterfactual history, so we don't know. On the other hand, we do know that Andrew Johnson was really, he ultimately was a racist who really botched Reconstruction. At first, Reconstruction was, sort of pro-African American and so forth, and there was a little sort of elevation of African Americans. But then Andrew Johnson's policies, there was a resurgence of conservatism and white supremacy in the South that snuffed out this kind of momentary empowerment of African Americans in the South. And I'm absolutely certain that Lincoln would have been much firmer about rights for previously enslaved people than Andrew Johnson was. I'm very certain about that. So anyway, that's just my point of view. Yeah.
So my take on it, the first thing I will say is that if Lincoln had lived, his historical reputation would have suffered from having had to deal with Reconstruction, because Reconstruction was the hardest time in American history to have been president of the United States. Andrew Johnson really made things worse. But Ulysses Grant and what Reconstruction did to Grant's reputation, I think, probably would have happened to Lincoln's reputation, because Grant was pretty much as devoted as Lincoln was to rights for the freedmen, for the former slaves. But the problem that both presidents would have encountered, and I'll leave Johnson out because his intentions were in the wrong direction, but Grant and Lincoln's intentions were pretty much in the same direction. But the first problem that Lincoln would have encountered was that he would not have been able to dictate to Congress in a way that he did during the war. And secondly, he and Congress together would not have been able to dictate to the South forever as they had been able to do during the war. During the war, you can use the army. During wartime, you don't have to persuade people, you can coerce people. The South was not convinced by Union arguments, it was convinced by Union arms. And the real question is, how long could Lincoln have, and then we know that Grant couldn't do it forever, how long can you keep troops in the South? In a democracy, how long can you rule by military force? And another way of putting it is, how long will the North continue to insist that the South behave the way that Northerners want the South to behave? And eventually, Northerners are going to say, we got other fish to fry. We'd rather be doing other things than keeping watch on the South. And that point was going to come sooner or later. I think it would have come for Lincoln, even if it might have outlasted his second term. He certainly would have had a third term, whatever John Wilkes Booth might have feared. And then it probably would have been Grant. And so I think it would have wound up the same way, because in a democracy, people get the government they deserve. And by the late 1870s, there was not a mobilizable majority of voters in the whole country to say, okay, we're going to require the South to honor the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the letter. And they're willing to let the 14th and 15th go. We'll leave the 13th in place. Yeah. So I think it would have turned out pretty much the same. The timing might have been a little bit different.
But I think you're exactly right about Lincoln's legacy being what it is in large measure because of being shot on Good Friday, Easter sermons in 1865 are all about Lincoln, and that sort of cements a legacy that would have gotten destroyed to some extent in the messiness of Reconstruction politics.
I liken Lincoln's situation to the situation that, well, historically Franklin Roosevelt dealt with. And I don't think it's coincidence that these two presidents are considered the two greatest American presidents, leaving aside George Washington because he was the first. So they deal with these great crises, but then through fate or an assassin's bullet, they exit the stage before things get really difficult. Franklin Roosevelt would have had to deal with the breakdown of the Grand Alliance and the emergence of the Cold War. And he would have had to deal with the things that made Harry Truman really unpopular during his presidency. And Lincoln would have had to deal with the stuff that made Ulysses Grant eventually unpopular and wrapped up in scandal and all that other stuff too.
Right. Right. We got a question asking either of you to talk about the parallels between John Wilkes Booth and John Brown, or the connections between them, with Brown being something of an inspiration for Booth. Brown, of course, or Booth being there at the execution of John Brown. Can either of you talk about John Wilkes Booth and John Brown together?
Yeah, well, Booth was of course, an actor, and he left the stage in Richmond just to go witness the execution of John Brown. But he looked at John Brown. Obviously, he detested everything John Brown stood for. Booth was a white supremacist and hated abolitionism, but he was really, really struck by the moxie of John Brown on the scaffold. John Brown was the calmest person there, the very calmest person there. And so eventually John Wilkes Booth calls John Brown the grandest man of the century. It was ironic that a lot of Southerners had much more positive things to say about John. They both demonized him, but they admired his kind of coolness under pressure. There was this thing about Southern honor and so forth. So I think that John Wilkes Booth tried to be John Brown in reverse, to be the grandest man of the century, but in the right cause. What for Booth was the right cause.
Right.
John Brown died for the wrong cause. John Wilkes Booth wanted to murder for what he considered the right cause, but he wanted to be John Brown in reverse, in effect. Yeah.
Bill, do you want to add to that?
It's striking to me that in some ways, considering what Wilkes Booth learned from John Brown and the speech that John Brown gave and before the court and on his way to being executed, that if Booth had been willing to take that final step, he certainly could have prepared a speech. He had the stage presence. He really could have done it. And he didn't have what David described as Brown's moxie.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. Can you both talk about the role of religion in these two men's lives and how it brought them to where they ended up? It's a big question, I know.
I'll try a little bit. This is simply my observation of Lincoln and my interpretation. I'll start with Lincoln, because I think Lincoln is the more interesting character. And I'll be very interested to hear if David has the same response to this or his own views. And that is that Lincoln seems to me to grow more religious the longer the war lasts, and the greater the moral burden of the war. And it's almost as though Lincoln says, at some level, I cannot bear the moral burden of this war. And I basically have to kind of hand this off to somebody else. So in his first inaugural address, Lincoln refers to the better angels of human nature, but he's not speaking directly to God or a version of that in the way he is in the second inaugural address, when he basically says, he comes really close to saying, this Civil War was God's will. And we needed, the business about if every drop of blood that's drawn by the slaver's lash must be repaid by a drop of blood drawn by the sword, well, it might be God's will. Boy, that's pretty close to saying, this was out of my hands. Don't blame me for this. God willed it that way. And it's a natural kind of response because this is one of those cases where if Lincoln had not made the decision that he made in response to Southern secession, then things would have been very different. It's very rare that a single person can be the hinge of fate that way. But if Lincoln had said, okay, to the South, I don't like it, but I'm not going to fight it. If he had taken the James Buchanan position, then there wouldn't have been a civil war, at least not then, and it would have been something else. But Lincoln had made that decision. He hoped that the war wouldn't last as long as it did. He hoped not so many people would be killed. But he had to look on this and say, I made this decision and all these people died. So heaven, help me with the responsibility for this.
Right. And David, let me ask just sort of part of my question that I didn't state before. They both came from a Calvinist tradition, if I recall. Is that correct?
Yeah. John Brown in particular, came from a Calvinist position, believing in predestination. And John Brown really believes that he was predestined appointed to fight against slavery, to make war against slavery. Lincoln came from a Baptist tradition. He never joined a church, but as Bill was saying, increasingly he becomes religious, not Orthodox Christian or anything like that. He never really joins a church, but his rhetoric becomes more and more religious, so that by the end, he almost sounds in that second inaugural, which is only about 700 words long, but it is full of religious references and quotations from the Bible and many mentions of God and all of that. And there is almost this sense of predestination or something bigger than himself. And that's why a few reviewers of the second inaugural said this was Lincoln's John Brown speech, or this was his Cromwell speech. So there is a kind of fusion, so to speak, in the kind of Calvinism of John Brown and the kind of whatever deterministic religious view that Lincoln has toward the end there. Yeah.
So we've got about 3 or 4 minutes, so I'm going to ask one more big question, and hopefully we can kind of fit it in. We often think about Lincoln as a political moderate. He's maybe a centrist. He's not a radical. But I think you both in different ways are sort of challenging that view of Lincoln. Can either of you talk about why it is we view Lincoln as a moderate and maybe why he's not?
I'll start and let David finish on this, because actually I'm going to say that I do consider Lincoln to be a political moderate. I think that Lincoln was very attuned to what was politically possible at each stage of his political evolution and at each stage of the war. And so, for example, if he had followed Frederick Douglass's advice at the beginning to say this is a war about slavery, the North would have lost, and that would have been that. Because the border states would have joined the Confederacy, would have had no choice. The federal government would have had to evacuate Washington, D.C., and it would have been nearly impossible to gain that back. But Lincoln understood that he couldn't do that. If he wanted to, if the end game was to save the Union and free the slaves, you have to do it in that order. You can't go front and center. So after Fort Sumter, when Lincoln requests 75,000 volunteers, what does he ask them to come to do? To defend the Union. If he had called for 75,000 volunteers to free the slaves, he might not have gotten anybody to show up, because Northerners would say they would defend the Union. Now, eventually, freeing the slaves became part of that. But Lincoln was really careful to understand, how is this going to happen? By the way, Lincoln believed from the beginning that slavery would be ended in the United States only by constitutional means, which is exactly what happened. It was the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. So it turned out to be right on that. So his moderation paid off.
Yeah, in my book, I compare him to Blondin, because he was often referred to as Blondin, and he himself called himself Blondin several times. Blondin was a tightrope walker who walked across Niagara Falls, forward, backward, on stilts, and so forth. And he was a centrist. Secretly, he was radical underneath, but his radicalism could not come out because it would really endanger the war. He said, if we lose Kentucky, we're going to lose everything. I mean, if we start losing the border states, we're just not going to win here. So he had to maintain this kind of centrist or left centrist point of view, for sure. Yeah.
Well, good. That brings us right to the mark where we need to be. I want to, again, thank our speakers, and I want to commend They're books to all of our viewers, 2 very large but worthwhile to read books. So I highly commend them to you all. I want to thank you both for wonderful talks and for engaging with our audience questions. I want to thank the staff at Ford's for making this possible. We hope that you at home enjoyed the program, and we hope that you'll join us again on April 5th when we have Ted Widmer and RJM Blackett. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you.